Good morning and welcome to the Moths of Essex County, Ontario, Part 1. This presentation is given for the Essex County Field Naturalist Club. And I hope you enjoy this presentation and that it's informative. So I'll share my screen here just to get started. So the first question that comes to mind whenever we look at a species of, well, not species, but a group of animals, what even is a moth? What do you think? You might be inclined to think this is a major softball question. You might be inclined to think I should have an obvious, easy, cut and dry answer, but it's actually quite difficult. One humorous answer that I've heard was kind of answered in the reverse. A butterfly is a moth that has better PR people. And I'll probably come back to this a couple times. But quite frankly, moths do receive some bad press, but they're really quite amazing creatures, and I hope this will make that evident. When we try to define a moth, there's a lot of usuallys. Almost everything that we think of in our mind to characterize a moth is a usually. There aren't really well-established rules to separate butterflies and moths, and there's lots of exceptions. There's also no taxonomic category for the concept of a moth. We arrive at a moth by subtraction in a sense. Essentially, we take the order Lepidoptera, which includes moths and butterflies, and then we take the group Papilionodea, which is butterflies, and we subtract that, and whatever is left over is a moth. And if you're doing a lot of searching on iNaturalists and their data, you'll notice that, because what happens there is you can't directly search for a moth. If you go in the species or the taxonomy, the taxon, essentially you have to put in Lepidoptera and then subtract the butterflies to get a moth. That does add a little difficulty in searching for moths on iNaturalist. Okay, what even is a moth? Part 2. So looking at a few things, this is by no means a complete list, but moths usually have wings. There are wingless moths, but they're not the norm in terms of what we see. Moths tend to be more nocturnal than butterflies. If you find a member of the order Lepidoptera during the day, most often it's a butterfly, and during the night, most often it's a moth. But there's a lot of exceptions to that. You will find moths both resting and flying during the day, and I do find butterflies at my moth sheets at night. Moths usually don't have clubbed antennae. That's usually a characteristic of butterflies, but there are exceptions to that. Moths have interesting antennae, sometimes feathered. Moths usually don't fold their wings vertically over their backs like butterflies do, but again, there's exceptions. Some of the carpet moths tend to do that, but most moths tend to fold their wings over their abdomen, like a tent. Moths tend to be duller. Yeah, no. This fact may be sponsored by the butterfly PR machine. It is true that there are a lot of moths that are rather dull and drab, and probably fewer proportionally butterflies that are. But again, I must disagree with the butterfly PR machine and say that there's incredible color and patterns in moths. In fact, some of the intensity, I think, exceeds that of the butterflies, but I may be biased. With some practice, it's pretty easy to tell between moths and butterflies in general. You don't have to be a moth enthusiast. Most of the general population, when given a clear picture of a moth or a butterfly at rest, not flying, most people can sort them out quite well. There are exceptions, and there are ones that are hard. So in general, moths are mothy, at least usually. So there's incredible moth diversity, and I feel like I won't be doing justice to the moth diversity, but I'm just going to list a few things here. There's way more moths than butterflies. As you can see on the slide, 180,000 worldwide species in Lepidoptera. Only about 10% of them are butterflies, 90% are moths. And in North America, the moths fare even better. About 95% of the Lepidoptera in North America are moths. And as you can see, North America has significantly less than 10% of the world's Lepidoptera species. Just to give a quick tour of some of these moths. On the left is a giant leopard moth, beautiful big moth, and the little circles look like they're etched by some sort of marker. The second one, I believe, is a saddleback caterpillar moth. That's a member of the family of slug moths. And that was actually, that particular one right there was in addition to the Ontario checklist. As far as I am aware, not reported in Ontario before. Then comes the rosy maple moth. That one certainly is a crowd pleaser. Beautiful pink color, yellow, very intense. That's a member of the family Saturnidae. It's in the same family as the Luna moth, which is quite popular. The rosy maple, like all Saturnids, does not eat as a moth. Of course, the caterpillar eats, but once it turns to an adult, its life is consumed with reproducing and dying, and I guess flying in between a bit too. Quite the life, but just amazing. The fourth moth, I'm actually not sure of its ID. It is in the family Pyralidae, but at this point I have forgotten what it is. Moth ID is extremely difficult. There's many species to remember. So I guess all that to say, if you are, getting to know moths, don't be discouraged. I mean, there's going to be so much that you don't know, can't identify. It doesn't really matter in a sense. I mean, you can admire their beauty and amazingness just as much without being able to identify the species necessarily. Alrighty. Moths are simply everywhere, and this is an amazing factor of their diversity, their ability to deal with climate. Even they found a colony of moths on the 83rd parallel in far northern Greenland. The average summer temperature just exceeds freezing a bit. I have no clue how those moths survive there, but they do. Moths come in endless colors, shapes, sizes, just incredible. And to make a comparison with humans in size, imagine that you were 4 feet tall and your cousin, your largest cousin, was 60 feet tall. That's basically the spread of moth sizes if you transpose them into the human species. Just absolutely incredible. 4 feet tall being the smallest little micro moth, 60 feet tall being the largest, probably Saturnid moth. So just absolutely incredible diversity in size as well. Oh, and I guess I should flip back to that slide. The photos will come in. On the far right is the Underwing, an Underwing moth, which is always a crowd pleaser when it opens its underwing. In the middle, I believe it's in the genus Cosmopteryx, a little tiny moth. And then on the left is the moth we saw on the first slide, which is the dogwood thyatrid. So to conclude here, I'm going to go through 3 slides of amazing moth facts, just to give an idea of some of the incredible things that moths do and their attributes. I don't know why the photos for this slide aren't popping in here. Maybe I forgot to put them on there. So moths' scales serve various purposes, and I'm not going to get into them here, but they can absorb bat sonar, which, as you imagine, is a great move in terms of avoiding predators. Bats are incredible predators of moths, and this is a great way to evade them. There's a moth species that have been observed in the wild to stay 14 years as a pupa. Just incredible. And especially when you compare that 14 years to the human life cycle. It's a pretty big chunk of a person's life, and the moth is waiting in this transitional phase. And then another thing is predatory moths. Most people don't realize that there are predators in the moth world, and some hide not only to keep themselves safe, but their camouflage is tailored, designed to allow them to stalk insects, which is incredible. There is a moth species, I believe, that eats snails as well, which is also incredible. And not only predating on other creatures, there is a genus, Heterogenus, which is a mother-eating moth. So basically, the mother lays her eggs and goes into a comatose state for 10 to 12 days, and that allows the hatchling to come and eat its mother, which is incredibly brutal. It's probably a good thing we're not doing this presentation on Mother's Day. We love our mothers, and it's hard to think that this goes on in the moth world, but it does. So the longest moth tongue in quotation marks, it's really a proboscis. It uses it to eat, is up to 11 inches, which is absolutely incredible. I've seen some pretty large ones, but 11 inches is amazing. There's a moth in Madagascar that feeds on the tears of sleeping birds. Incredible. There's a male moth that's been reported to have flown over 22 miles in response to the smell, the pheromones of the female of its species. Now, some people have used these pheromones to attract moths when they go mothing. I have not, but there is that incredible sense of smell must be present. And there's also a moth species that uses shrill ultrasounds to attract a mate. It's little known and little researched, but sound actually does play a pretty big role in moth biology, and we're just starting to figure out those things. I think it's incredible to think that moths can even make noises, but they do. And then numerous moth species mimic bird droppings. I've seen a handful of them here in Essex County. They're pretty amazing, and there's different ways in which they try to appear to be bird droppings. So vampire moths, us nature enthusiasts tend to downplay risk, right? If we're talking about rattlesnakes, we want to downplay the paranoia and fear in regard to them, or spiders. But I certainly don't want to avoid the fact that there are vampire moths. Those of us in North America can rest easy knowing that there are none in North America. In Asia and Europe, there are moths that actually pierce the skin of mammals to feed on their blood. So pretty gruesome. But again, this just plays into the amazing diversity and biology of these creatures, and kind of play into the argument that I would make that you shouldn't ignore them. You shouldn't, you should be fascinated by them, because they're just incredible creatures, and they're all around us. And there's a bit of mystique around them because, generally speaking, you're not seeing them during day. And generally speaking, if you want to see a bunch of them, you need to have a way to attract them. There are a few moth species that can swim as well. And there is a moth species that plays dead. rather than flying away. So, I mean, we're just starting to scratch the surface here. This is not complete. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of the amazing creatures that we're talking about. And it's not necessarily an easy read, but if you want, if this has really fascinated you and you want to dive quite deeply, a new book called Moths, A Complete Guide to Biology and Behavior is amazing. A lot of these facts are from there. So this was really only meant to whet your appetite. There will be subsequent presentations, and I think this gives you a good starting point. I hope you've enjoyed it, and feel free to drop me a line on social media if you have any questions. I am not an expert. I am not a biologist. I am not, an authoritative person on all things moths. I must give that caveat. I am what I would call enthusiastic amateur, and I wanted to share some of those things with you. So until next time, take care.